Welcome to the Tippy Top, the podcast that helps entrepreneurs succeed by sharing best practice and creating alignment with investors. You'll hear from seasoned entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and industry professionals. The Tippy Top helps you learn vicariously because you simply don't have the time to learn every lesson through the school of hard knocks. Now, I said we'd have seasoned entrepreneurs on the show, and true to form, here we have Mike Morgan. What an honor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alex. The honor is all mine, I can assure you.
That's very kind, Mike. Thank you. Now, Mike and I only met, I think, earlier this year in 2021, but it seems that we've collaborated on so many startups, really helped the entrepreneurs. And it's really been such an interesting learning journey for me. And I thought, what better person to have on the show? We've collaborated on a few webinars already, speaking to entrepreneurs, trying to help them, sharing Mike's story. And so first up, I thought, Mike, would you like to tell us a bit about your background and tell the listeners about this really quite incredible entrepreneurial journey?
Sure, I'd love to. So I started out in my career in a rather unconventional place. I was actually in the Royal Air Force as a commissioned officer for several years. And then my career shifted into sales and marketing. And I started out in a very basic sales roles in office automation with Pitney Bowes and Xerox. And then I moved into the high-tech market with Compaq Computer, Hewlett-Packard and Sony, first in the UK and Ireland, and then I moved into pan-European roles. After 10 years of climbing the corporate ladder, I suppose I became rather disillusioned with the politics and the inertia, and I was drawn to the world of startups. I guess that was back in 2005. And I founded my first business called Channelsphere, which I still run today, with the purpose of passing on my experiences of developing and deploying go-to-market strategies, principally to entrepreneurs and their teams. And I also made a number of investments in early SaaS businesses back then as well. I became increasingly involved in one of my clients who developed a marketing automation platform for companies with indirect sales channels. And I went on to acquire that business with my co-founder and began to heavily invest in improving the tech. And then we expanded into North America. I moved my family to California in 2011. And then we raised a Series A in 2013. We then moved our global HQ from Oxford to Jersey City on the East Coast, and then we raised more cash through a debt round before I exited that business with our Series B in 2016. But actually, since a year before that, in 2015, I'd returned at least part-time to working with other founders and in a part-time basis as a consultant. I was also doing advisory work and NED work. And after my exit, I founded my own Harley-Davidson custom shop and dealership here in Cheshire, which I ran for 3 years in parallel with Channelsphere, before selling that business on to another dealer network. And since then, I've led 2 turnarounds in e-commerce software businesses for the shareholders, and invested in one of those businesses and exited that through a trade sale 2 years ago. And I founded and run a startup e-commerce SaaS business for a leading UK retailer. And today, Channelsphere really fills most of my time, to be fair. And I sit on the boards of a number of UK SaaS and tech-enabled businesses as an advisor, NED, and exec chairman. And of course, our connection, Alex, is that I'm also on the board as an observer for the Development Bank of Wales and a number of your seed fund portfolio companies.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, there's just so much experience there. And I think it's worth saying that's why we thought it would not be doing justice to try and squeeze this into one podcast episode. And that's why we've actually taken the bold decision to split it over 2. And I'm sure there's just equal value in both episodes. So I hope you do watch both. Now, in terms of the three main topics, we've split it up 3 per episode. Part 1, we're going to look at mental health in entrepreneurship. Number 2, we're going to look at why you should focus on your customers. And 3, the importance of outsourcing yourself. Moving on to part 2, we're going to look at that, how to deal with investors. And then an interesting one, what they don't teach you at business school about being an entrepreneur. And then, of course, finally, 3 exits, the end game. Back to part 1, though. Mike, mental health in entrepreneurship. You've always said that businesses are run by people. It's about you and me. Tell us more.
Yes. First, a confession from me, which you probably haven't heard this before, but I'm a lifelong sufferer with stress, anxiety, and occasionally depression as well. And I think that all 3 of these conditions are very closely linked, certainly are in my case. And I honestly couldn't have been drawn to a life more likely to trigger these issues if I'd tried. Running your own business exposes you to relentless pressure from all sides. And I think for most entrepreneurs, the one applying most of the pressure most of the time is the entrepreneur themselves. We are by and large very driven people. We set up our own businesses because being our own boss and being in charge of our own destiny, are appealing to us. And success is also very important to us. And we'll often put the achievement of that success ahead of certainly our needs and our family's needs. And we'll take huge risks and expose ourselves to a lot of suffering. And it certainly takes its toll.
I actually didn't know that. What do you find are the best ways to cope?
Well, I'd like to tell you that I was an expert in mastering my own mental health issues in general, but certainly whilst I was running my own businesses. But in all honesty, I learned the lessons quite late. So you might expect me to say things like, well, you've got to achieve a better work-life balance. You've got to take time out. You've got to focus on self-care and all of those things that we're told. But the truth is that, when you're struggling with all of the pressures of running a startup business and you're working, often 7 days a week out of necessity, not out of choice, it's very hard to force yourself to do these things. And what I really only learned in the last few years is that you have to have someone to talk to. Being a CEO is the loneliest of jobs at the best of times. But when it's just you, or when it's you and often a very inexperienced leadership team looking to you for leadership, it's a lot lonelier still. So I think my advice to any entrepreneur is to find someone to listen to you, very simply. But it's got to be somebody that you respect and somebody that you trust, someone that's going to be willing to share their advice and guidance very candidly. There's a lot of people out there on the market touting their services as executive coaches or mentors. Pestered by them constantly. But most of them, for I think entrepreneurs and founders of businesses, don't really cut it. Because from my experience, entrepreneurs need support from fellow entrepreneurs. People who've actually been through the very trials and tribulations they've faced or they're currently facing today, and people who've learned how to overcome them the hard way by making mistakes. We'll talk about that later. You need somebody that you can really share your innermost secrets with. So not only related to the business, but also personal matters which might impact your ability to lead the company. As you know, when I was running my business, went through a very traumatic divorce, which had, far-reaching implications for my children and the family in general. And trying to run a business through that period was incredibly difficult, and I had nobody to talk to. And of course, question of reaching out to counselors, I didn't have the time, frankly. I was certainly convinced of myself that I didn't have the time. So the person that you need to talk to, you literally have to be able to laugh and cry in their company and feel that comfortable to do it, because certainly at times you might be brought to the latter. You've also got to have somebody who can expose you to the harshest of criticism, and that you'll take it on the chin, and you'll be prepared to listen from it. And I didn't do these things. So we're talking here about the lessons we learn. I didn't do them. I tried to survive and to run my business, on using my own counsel alone. And I made a lot of mistakes as a consequence. But I think if you can find somebody to do this for you and do it, find them fairly early, I think they'll do a lot more for your long-term mental health than any prescription drugs or mindfulness exercises that we're all encouraged to do ever will. So that would be certainly my big advice to everybody.
No, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I certainly appreciate your honesty, because there's so much glamorization of entrepreneurship and the sexy startup, and no one talks about this mental health probably until it's too late. And I think that's just a cold, hard view, very sobering of what it's really like, and absolutely invaluable advice that you need someone in your corner, and someone who really can, empathize, not just sympathize with you. So, well said. And with the pressure that's in startups and the pressure to succeed, and it looks like everyone else is raising these really big rounds, do you think that mental health's getting worse or better in entrepreneurship?
This is a good question. My wife is actually a counsellor, so I have to confess again that I have, these are topics that we discuss at home quite frequently. And I think that the question that you've asked, could be asked more generally about society. Is mental health becoming a bigger issue in society? Are mental health issues on the rise in general? And actually, I'm not convinced they are. I said to you a moment ago that I suffer from stress, anxiety, and occasionally depression. 20 years ago, we didn't put a name to these conditions. We didn't admit to suffering with them, and we certainly didn't seek help either back then. I think if I'd have ever confided in a work colleague 20 years ago that I was suffering from mental health problems, I probably would have been laughed at, and probably fear of that happening dissuaded me from doing it. But today, saying I have mental health problems is not a source of embarrassment or shame at all. Mental health is something that's discussed widely in the media, and you only have to pick up a paper or watch the news to see a celebrity or a business leader opening up about their difficulties every day. So I think in general, society, I think, has been very supportive, and I think that it's far more socially acceptable to have mental health issues and to admit having them and to talk about them today than ever before, and that's a really, really good thing. But to address the specific point you've made, founding and running a startup has to be one of the most stressful things that anyone can do in civilian life. There are things in non-civilian life that are far more stressful, believe me. But in a business, even if things go well from the get-go, and they usually don't, every day presents you with new challenges. And for most entrepreneurs, it's a case of having to learn very fast on the job. When things are more of a struggle, and they usually are, entrepreneurs are, as I said before, they're exposed to this unrelenting pressure to make the right decisions day in, day out. Often they're making those decisions on their own without guidance and support, unless, of course, as I suggested earlier on, they found somebody to help them with that. And they're doing this whilst dealing with cash shortages, staffing challenges, and of course later on shareholder scrutiny, which can be stressful in of itself. So do entrepreneurs suffer with stress, anxiety, and depression, and frankly at times mental and physical exhaustion? Absolutely. I think it's always been the case, but I think and I'm pleased to say that I think that more than ever before, they feel able to talk about it, to share it with other people, and seek support. And I think one experience which was incredibly powerful to me in a business that I recently ran for shareholders, I was, as you probably gathered, quite a few years older than the average member of staff, and a number of the team were suffering from mental health problems, and it was immensely powerful and actually very cathartic for me to actually sit down with some of these young guys and girls who shared these experiences with me, and they were quite surprised that I shared my experiences with them as well. And I think, I really encourage them to get help. But that's another thing. I think as an entrepreneur and a founder, to open up to your own people about the challenges that you're facing is incredibly powerful, because the chances are that they'll also be experiencing their own demons as well.
Yeah, exactly. Makes you all realize everyone else is just human, also with their own struggles. And the only thing I can take away from that is that the silver lining is that we're allowed to talk about it now.
Yeah.
And that, adage of a problem shared is a problem halved, but quite daunting listening to you there. Okay, moving on slowly to part two on the commercial side. You've mentioned that startups should always focus on their customers. So, and particularly that's when resources are low. If you have to prioritize, it's always your customers. Why is that?
Well, I mean, simplistically, because they pay the bills, obviously. But most entrepreneurs start out with an idea, and the idea is a solution to a problem, or it's the satisfaction of a need that either they've experienced or they've observed being experienced in the market. And if you found a way to solve a problem or satisfy a need for your customers, and they've indicated that they're willing to pay for you to do it for them, then everything you do has to be guided by them. And particularly, as you said, when resources are constrained, because your customers can actually be the best product architects, the best product testers, the best marketing resources, and the best salespeople you'll ever find. And certainly they've done that role for me many times in the past.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Also, in terms of when times are tough, it's far easier to ask your customers for money than your investors.
Yes, well, we'll talk about that later on, but there's a lot of founders struggle with that concept, and instead of digging deep and selling harder, they as very often come back looking for more from their investors. And you're right, customers should always be the first port of call.
Absolutely. And you've also mentioned how focusing on customers drives growth, and then that translates into your future roadmap. Talk us through
that. It's very common, and again, you'll certainly recognize this, I'm sure, sitting on the boards of many startup businesses. It's very common for entrepreneurs to stray from the path. After a while, once they get the minimum viable product out there, they can become quite easily and quickly fixated on competitors and what the competitors are building, and the way the competitors are addressing the market, or on building, the next cool new product or new features into the product they've already built. And they do it just because they can. They've got an army of developers there, and they want to utilize them. And this is when you can get into a whole lot of trouble, because you've got to keep sight of the fact that your job is to solve for the customer. You've got to find out what they need from you to solve their problems in the most efficient and effective manner. That's it. You've got to find out what they love about the product and don't mess with it. And then you've got to find out what they don't like so much, or what they think's missing, to make it, the best it can be. And then you need to fix or build it. And if you ever have to suggest features to a customer, then the chances are they just don't need them.
I never knew that, but it makes sense. And in terms of listening to customers, when do you not listen to them? Because I mean, sometimes we ask them, what do you want? And there's that great Henry Ford one, faster horses. No, I'll give you a car instead. So how do you get that balance right?
So apologies, but I do draw a lot of analogies with my past military life, and I don't know if you've ever heard the military term "stay on mission." But when you've got a product business, you need to decide what your mission is and stay on it. So, every entrepreneur, you very early on should define their vision and mission, and then and the mission is your purpose, your values, and your goals. And I think, to answer the question, when not to listen to your customers when they start asking you to do things that are not part of your mission. And that's one of the reasons why having a very clearly understood mission, not only understood by you, but understood by everyone in the business, is really important. So some experiences, that I've had in the past of where customers ask you to do stuff that you really shouldn't do because it's not part of the mission. When they come and ask you to build custom features that only fulfill their unique requirement, sometimes they will dangle lots of money in front of you and say, look, please, if you build it for me, I'll pay you to build it. Don't, because it's not part of the mission. And what you're going to do is build something that you've now got to support uniquely for one customer, and you'll probably never sell it again. And what you've done is you've distracted key resources in your business away from the mission. Other examples are when customers ask you to adapt the product for adjacent markets. So they might say, well, we know you built a great product for large enterprises, but you could easily sell this to SMEs as well if you made the following changes. But if the mission is to build a product that addresses the needs of large enterprises or vice versa SMEs, don't switch, because again, you're going to consume valuable resources off mission. Other ones, we've got an operation in the United States. Could you localize your product so that we could use it over there? Well, you could, provided that moving to the United States is part of the mission and it's within the timeframes that you're originally planning. But if it's not, stay on the mission again. And I think other ones as well, I've had, with customers asking me to modify the organizational structure or change people or modify the structure of the team, again, to suit their needs. Bad customer. Everything has to be linked to the mission, and you've got to stay on it doggedly and never deviate for the sake of one or two customers.
Yeah, hugely valuable. I think I've heard that saying, not all customers are created equal. And you don't have to be super subservient to them all. And the other one that comes through is that MVP, the true MVP, and that's the mission, values, purpose. And for me, that's the board's responsibility, or why you have a board, to keep you on that mission. And I really love that military analogy.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Great. Let's go on to part 3. So the importance of outsourcing yourself. And I think on this one, it's a funny conundrum because, as you say, as an entrepreneur, you're working 24/7 and you're asked to do everything. Yet on one hand, everyone says, don't get too attached, kind of be ready to dive out of the business at any time. Can you help explain how to get that dynamic right?
Yeah, I think, again, it's one of those cases of say as I, or do as I say rather than do as I do, because I'm not sure I achieved this mission in particular, but it should be at least an important goal of every entrepreneur to make themselves what I classify or term as operationally redundant, and they need to do that as soon as possible. And when you've done that properly, it means that you've recruited well, you've trained well, and you've delegated, and this is crucial, both of these, you've delegated both responsibility and accountability properly within your organization. Don't misunderstand me though. An entrepreneur should never abdicate responsibility for devising and revising the company strategy, and they should always be I think they should be the figurehead and the face of the company to the market, to customers, and to their own team. But I've met so many entrepreneurs who sort of fooled themselves into thinking that they're indispensable, and sadly, those that do are rarely found in successful scale-up businesses. The successful ones have figured this one out quite early. And the other thing with this as well is that, which I've seen it go the other way, being operationally redundant doesn't mean that you're operationally absent. So you can see founder CEOs who they drift away from the business, the day-to-day of the business, and they start to they're the ones who can't tell you what their revenue was last month, or how much they spent on marketing, or how many people they've got in the development team, and you've got to maintain that. You've got to maintain that proximity and a really tight fix on what's going on in the business. I would say keep your finger on the pulse. And the analogy, again, another analogy coming here is a ship at sea, right? So the captain can't ensure that the correct course is being followed and that you're going to arrive at the destination that you're intended to arrive at if they're in the engine room. They've got to lead from the bridge. That's not to say that they don't maintain contact with their crew and their lieutenants, but they lead from the bridge, and that's where you need to be.
Powerful analogy, that one everyone can remember. And I just want to come back. There's a saying that you coined, Mike Morgan, make yourself operationally redundant and strategically indispensable. Amazing.
Yeah, that's it. And I think we'll come on to, I know that we've got some topics to discuss later about relationships with shareholders, and we'll touch on that again, no doubt.
Great. And now they say that corporate types don't make good entrepreneurs because, and the adage was that they can't send faxes, so they can't actually do entrepreneurship because they had some secretary or PA doing that for them, and they just go to meetings and have copies all day. Now, how does that differ between being that strategic person and actually delivering?
Well, I'm not sure I could operate a fax machine now after all these years either, but I hear what you're saying, and as you well know, and I already said here, I was once one of those corporate types. So and it's absolutely true that when I moved from an executive position at Sony to being all of a sudden the head of sales, head of marketing, head of finance, the head of service delivery, head of customer support, et cetera, and I didn't, for the first time in many years, have a PA and a big, bottomless expense account to draw on. comes as a shock, but I think it helps enormously if you've had a, what I might term a proper job. So, I'll elaborate on that, but to have a proper job before you then move into entrepreneurship, I think is very grounding, and it gives you it's invaluable experience. And it's worth remembering that in spite of all their faults, large companies got large by doing a lot of things right. Okay, so if you work for them, then you can learn a lot about best practice. From my perspective, my background was in sales and marketing primarily, and I got first-class training and professional development from the big corporates that I worked for, no doubt. And I was also exposed to best practices in a range of operational functions, including customer support and success, because they're aligned very much with my departments. And I also learned about HR, finance, and I was also, which came in handy later, quite adept at formulating pitches to secure investment from other stakeholders in the business. And the formula for doing that, by the way, is just the same as it is for pitching to you, Alex. So that came very handy for me as well. What I would say, though, which is a slightly different point to the question you asked, I would really caution entrepreneurs to be careful when they're hiring their leadership team, and when they're potentially considering hiring leadership team members who are corporate types, because corporate types can make great founding entrepreneurs from experience, and I didn't do too badly. But from my experience, they don't necessarily make great startup team members. You're asking somebody to come into your business who doesn't have the same vested interests, and for them to adapt, from a life in a large corporate to suddenly working in a startup, from experience, it doesn't usually go too well. And unfortunately, I've made some poor decisions when I'm hiring into executive positions, which I've then had to correct later, and it's been quite painful in doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine. I mean, yeah, so much to go for there. And I mean, just to come back on your point on pitch decks, I've seen your decks and they are stellar. So you certainly learned a thing or two in your time. Just one final thing for the entrepreneurs, and you may have already covered it, so we can cover it briefly. But what's the difference between working on your business and in your business? I think it's part of this mix. But how do you know when to dive in and when to step out?
I mean, I said earlier on that shifting the emphasis of your role from working on your business instead of in it, that's going to be very high on entrepreneurs on an entrepreneur's agenda from the outset, because the business shouldn't be dependent on you for any longer than it's absolutely necessary. And by the time you make it to a Series B, or sometimes sooner, VCs will expect the founder to be spending certainly less than 20% of their time operationally engaged, because they don't want to invest in a business that is dependent upon the founder for obvious reasons. And I think if you focus on building a first-class team and empowering them to lead, the step back from the coalface actually comes quite naturally, and your role then shifts to leading the leadership team, and through them, maintaining oversight of the business, so that your strategic thinking, so thinking about where you're going to take the business next, is properly informed by what's happening in the business today.
And is it tough to let go, because you've given birth to this baby or startup, and you're saying, "Oh, you go run it for me. I'll kind of step back." Does that work in reality?
It is. I mean, I probably made it sound easy just because it's the right thing to do. I don't think it's easy for a lot of founders to do it. Again, what I hear a lot, Alex, is I can't delegate that to somebody else because no one will do it as well as I do it. I mean, for example, I work with a couple of founders at the moment who, years down the line are still the only salesperson for their company. And you ask them why, and they say, "Oh yeah, I tried hiring salespeople and it didn't work out." Well, you can hazard a guess as to why, but it is sometimes people really don't like to step back. I think a lot of entrepreneurs are control freaks as well. I'm one, and it's difficult to take your hands off the reins, but you've got to do it. And once you do it, actually, and you do it for the first time, and you actually trust somebody to do a job for you, a job that you thought only you could do, and they prove you right, it's a wonderful, liberating feeling. And actually what you now want to do is go out and do it all over again. Let's find some other part of my role that I could entrust somebody else to do and maybe do a better job than I did. That's great. And then when you've got none left to delegate, then you can really focus on leading the company where it needs to go next, instead of worrying about what you're doing in the business today.
And I think that the motivation that some entrepreneurs need is that exit. You don't want to have a 5-year earn out because the business is so dependent on you, and you need to start that early. So that's why at board meetings we often say put exit on the agenda, just to focus everyone's mind on where we're going, and we're going to touch on that shortly.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and to be for founders themselves, but certainly the boards to be saying to the founder, listen, do you really want, when somebody comes along to buy your business, do you really want to be locked in for years because the company cannot function without you? Don't you just want to be able to disappear off into the sunset with your cash? And nobody wants to be chained to a business that they've already sold. So I think it's the best incentive possible to any founder to let go of the reins and start delegating. But there's always that fear. If I make myself operationally redundant, does that mean that I'm no longer needed? Well, I think the answer to that's fairly obvious.
Yeah, and you actually end up going back as an employee, which is probably what you got away from. That's why you started the business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. I'm going to summarize that, or do my best to. So much in there, and then we're going to move on. So first up, mental health in entrepreneurship. I think the most important lesson I took away was find someone to talk to. It's okay to tell people about it, and you must in order to cope. But also that person you find, don't just find a generic coach, find an entrepreneur who's been there, done it before, and you can really open up to someone who can really empathize and guide you at the same time. And number 2, why you should focus on your customers. Well, yes, you should, but make sure, to Mike's analogy, you stay on mission and work out what your MVP is, your mission, values, and purpose. And then point number 3, the importance of outsourcing yourself. Mike said, train well, recruit well, and the catchphrase, make yourself operationally redundant whilst strategically indispensable. Well said, Mike. Now, we're going to go to part 2 shortly, but do you just want to tell the listeners in part 1 where they can find you online?
Yeah, so I'm available on LinkedIn, so you can contact me there. I'm contactable through my website, www.channelsphere.com, and you can also contact me via my email, mike@channelsphere.com. I'm not a Twitterer, so you won't find me there, but by all means, reach me online or in the old-fashioned ways.
Yeah, and Mike's very responsive, which is a fantastic characteristic, which I really admire. Now, thanks very much again, Mike. And now, listeners out there, if you're anything like me, you probably can't wait to get stuck into part 2. Now, reminder what we're covering with how to deal with investors. One of my favorites now, what they don't teach you in business school about being an entrepreneur. And we're going to expand more on exit. So we'll see you in a bit. That's all for this episode. Keep tuning in for more exclusive content on how to succeed as an entrepreneur. Make sure that you follow the Tippy Top on all social channels, including Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, or now Meta, Insta, YouTube, with @the_Tippy_Top blog. And check out my website, thetippytop.com. And you can also find me, Alexander Lee, on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep pushing, and I'll see you at the Tippy Top. Cheers.